Uh, Good afternoon. My name is Umeo Roy Uyeda, and I was born in Celtic Cannery, well, maybe roughly about 18 kilometers from the center. Uh, when I was born, there was no cannery, but in fact, it closed down 17 years before I was born in 1933. There used to be a cannery, but the salmon run just went down, so the cannery closed down. The cannery opened up in the uh, early 1890s. So 17 years before I was born, it closed down. But the name remained, Celtic Cannery name remained even after the war. Yeah, I came, anyways. Um, it was a close knit fishing hamlet, with about 25 Japanese families, and all of them were involved in the fishing industry, and there were maybe two, three white single fishermen in the hamlet, but otherwise they're all Japanese. And most of the Japanese were from Japan, so the language spoken there was mostly Japanese. So I spoke Japanese before I spoke English until school time. Until one gets to the school age, then he or she would have to switch over to English, you know. And the because most of the adults were from Japan, the culturally in Celtic Cannery, everything was Japan oriented, and we used to see movies, but they're all the movies were from Japan, and although I was living in Canada, I knew more about Japan than than Canada, were my home country. That's how much, because all the adults, like I said, they're from Japan. And anyway, when I was 5 years and 10 months old, my father and mother took me and a sister 2 years older to Japan. In those days, many Japanese families to send their young kids to Japan for education, being looked after by the grandparents, and so my family was no exception. But there was another reason we went there, because my mother fell down the stairs and she injured her shoulder, and the family thought that if she used the hot springs in Japan, as you may know, there's so many hot springs and a lot of nice hot springs. So my father is from Kyushu, northern Kyushu, and Beppu Hot Spring is the biggest hot springs in Japan. So it's about 60 miles from our town, and the family thought she should go there and use the hot springs to recuperate and use that as a means of treatment. And so for two reasons, we went there, and that was 1939, and that was first time for me in Japan. But for mother and dad, it was about 30, 40 years after they'd been in Canada. And from the spring of 1940, I was put into the local Japanese elementary school. My sister and I were put in, and I started from grade one, and that's when my formal schooling began. And but my dad came back to Canada after 6 months, and when his boat was going back to Japan, our second oldest brother, he took this boat that was going back there. He got on that boat, and so he went to Japan in early 1940. And anyways, and then a little while later, my oldest brother too came to Japan. My oldest brother came a little bit later after my second brother came to Japan. And in the meantime, my mother fell ill, and she passed away in late January or early February 1941. And had my mother not passed away, my sister and I most likely would have been stayed there and educated in Japanese school. But after our mother passed away, there was nobody to look after myself and my sister. So the family decided that my eldest brother would bring us back to Vancouver. So that was late May 1941. And my second brother, he stayed there. And he graduated from a established good school in Chicago, Illinois, an electrical school. And so he got a diploma from there, and he became not an engineer, but a high-grade technician in electricity, you see. But in the greater Vancouver area, there was no chance, no opportunity whatsoever because of racial discrimination. So my father urged him to go to Japan, knowing that he could get a good job there. And in the northern Kyushu, there's a major electrical firm called Yasukawa Electrical Works. And he applied, and he got a job right away. And his latest technology, electricity, and he's a very conscientious man, so it didn't take long for his superiors and co-workers to like him, and at last the future looked bright for him. Anyway, that was it. And then in 1941, my sister and I were brought back to Vancouver by our oldest brother, and that September I was put into the first grade in Kerrisdale Elementary School, which is right near Carnarvon Street and 41st Avenue. And I started, my contemporaries were in grade 3, but because of my complete inability in English, I was put in 2 grades behind, And even that was a challenge. I couldn't even understand, not even half, maybe even less than half what the teacher was saying. But I did my best, and school life was not bad. And until that eventful day in December, that Pearl Harbor happened on on a Sunday, and on the Monday morning when I came to school, it was a few minutes before the class was started, so I passed a group of small boys talking together, and as I passed there, one of them said, "Here's a Jap," And ever since then, every day after school, there'd be some kids hiding behind the bushes. They would shower me with rocks, So every day I had to come up with a strategy to elude these kids hiding behind the bushes to shower me with rocks, and so it was not a pleasant thing at all. That was in December, and in early March, all the families except mine in Celtic Cannery all moved out. They went to the prairies, to the sugar beet farms, My dad, somehow, I don't know how he managed, but he refused to go with that crowd. And so in May, even in May, we were still out loose in Celtic Cannery. And one day a government official came and told my father that we are no longer allowed to live freely like that. So we were told to hurry up and get a few belongings together, and one suitcase in each hand kind of thing. Then we were sent to Hastings Park, and we didn't stay there too many weeks. I don't remember how many weeks, but sometime in June, or maybe early July. I think it's June. Yeah, we were shipped inland to the interior, and we were sent to Slocan Valley. And when we got there, the families who went there before us, they were all housed in these former saloons and hotels, abandoned. They got some instantly trained Japanese carpenters, and they renovated the place. And if it's a big hotel or something like that, there will be several families housed there. And when these houses and saloons and these buildings ran out, they used army tents, and we were housed in that place, in that kind of thing. And then I don't know for how many long. Just 1942. They say, just before winter came on, we were housed in these flimsy uniform houses. Well, they're a little bit better than shacks, and we were housed in those and these houses, they use thin planks, and they put we used to call it tar paper for insulation to cut the wind out. They have one plank, and then put these coal tar paper, and then another plank. So it cuts out the wind, but to keep out the cold, it didn't work at all. So I could remember in the middle of the winter, I used to when it was so cold, I used to go like this, because there's only the one wood burning stove right in the middle of the house, you see, and the heat never gets to the bedrooms on the east side, and it was a very hard winter, and the temperatures really dropped, and then it snowed a lot there. But one ironic thing, I don't know what the adults were going through, but for us kids, Slocan was a haven. Because, the atmosphere in Vancouver was so ugly, and we Japs had, we were just we're in the dirt, and so. But over there, I felt so free. I didn't have to feel nobody to look down on us or call us names and all that. So and the mountains all over, and we used to go up in the mountains, pick berries, and look for these warabi, and then nuts. We pick nuts in the autumn, and then there to go up into the mountains. I really enjoyed it. There's big, nice lake with clean water and good swimming, good fishing, and a nice river flowing out. And we could do more fishing, more swimming, and there's other creeks we could do more fishing. But the adults were not free to fish. If adults were caught fishing, he or she would be, well, it's mostly he, but they would be fined, and on top of that, the fishing gear would be all confiscated. But kids, it was okay. But I took a couple of trips with the adults. We were, I mentioned in the trip we had in 2017, we pack sandwiches, and these backpacks, and leave before sunup in the dark. We would go up into the far deep mountain creek and fish all day long, and then we come back after the sundown in the dark, so nobody would see us. And then just back full of these, what you call, we used to call them mountain trout. They're Darji, no, I forget the name. We used to call them mountain trout, but they're good eating. You roll them in flour and fry them in butter, and it's really good eating. And then that kind of thing. Otherwise, the adults, if they're caught, they would be fined, you see, and their fishing gear would be all confiscated. So, anyways, that was that kind of life we led, and then that was 1940. We went there in 42 and 43, 1943 spring school. We missed school for almost 1 year, and school began for us, and the teachers all Nisei, most of them were Nisei high school graduates. But I must say the education I received in Spokane was very good. The standard was very good, and I learned a lot there. And yeah, it was a very good school, and we were treated very strictly. No hanky-panky kind of, no fooling around. And anybody who didn't make grades, they would be dropped, or they would stay in the same grade, and all that. So the school and the provincial government had a iron grip on us, and there was a very efficient system, I would say. Anyhow, in 1943, I think was one day we received a letter from Japan, relatives in Japan, through the International Red Cross, and the relatives told us that my second brother, who was there before the war, he got conscripted into the Japanese army, and so and our relatives said that he was he was shipped to Burma, now we call it Myanmar, and so that was the only time that we had any communication from Japan. This was 1943 that I think we heard from Japan. Anyways, in early 1945, the Canadian government gave us an ultimatum that anybody who wanted to stay in Canada, they go east of the Rockies, and if that's not satisfactory, ship out to Japan. And then we were called repatriates, means that you go back to your former place of birth. But more than, 65% or something, the kids were all Canadian born, and a lot of them even speak English. I mean, Japanese. They didn't even speak, they'd never been there, they didn't even speak Japanese. Whereas I had 2 years of schooling there, so for me, I wasn't going to a strange country. But when we got there, the first signs of war damage or ravage was when one evening our ship entered the Yokohama harbor. That's the first port of call, and you could see the damages in the harbor port area where the B-29s did a thorough job. And that was the first sign that we knew that Japan was heavily bombed all over Japan was heavily bombed by these B-29s, and that was first sign of war damage that we saw. But anyways, we disembarked at Uraga, just a little ways south of Yokohama, and so we got aboard, and then from there we were trucked over coastal mountains, a lot of coastal mountains, small mountains. So we were trucked over these mountains to a place called Kurihama, and that's the place where, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, with its 4 black warships, came and demanded Japan to open up reports, or they'll let them have it, And so there's a big monument with English So that's the place where he landed in 1853. But anyways, there was a huge, I think it's a basic Japanese Imperial naval basic training center. It's a huge ground and a huge 3-story barracks, and we were housed in a couple of these barracks for about two weeks, I guess, maybe. And we were fed the surplus Japanese armed forces food that they still had left over. So we were fed those, and then we put on a special train, and each sent to his own domicile. And my father's domicile, northern Kyushu, and the trains we got on were every station stopping trains, and it was so slow, and took 2 days in the hot summer, and it was murderous. And what disgusted me and really made me sick to my stomach, and I felt so hopeless that every time the train came to a station, there would be hordes of people with stuffed backpacks, and it's hot, so all the windows are open, and they would throw in their backpacks through the windows, and they would literally crawl over four of us sitting there, literally crawl over our knees to get inside. They didn't bother going in from boarding the train from the proper, they just, and everybody for himself, and the strong got the survival of the fittest kind of thing. Then the strongest got the best, and they would fight for seats and all that, and all that's happened all the way to Kyushu, and along the way we would see these bombed out shells of factory, and the big electrical motor left in the corner with nothing else, and just this steel girders of the factory skeleton, that kind of thing. And we saw lots of these, devastation and very unpleasant. But when we got to Hiroshima, everybody, their mouth was all agape. Nobody said anything because the place was just flat, and just few lean-tos, And the station was the rough timber banged together, and everything was just flattened out. But on our trip to Kyushu, there was one bright thing that we looked forward to, especially my dad. That was his second son, his favorite son, whom he so doted. This son was dutiful and quiet and studious and all that. And so my dad looked forward to, and we did too. But my dad first, most of it, we looked forward to reuniting him with him. But the evening that we reached our father's village, we were housing. We were given lodging by a kind person, and the first thing that my sisters and I asked the family was, "Where is our brother?" And we asked the oldest daughter, and she was just stuck for words, and she said, "Mother, what should I do?" And so we knew that our brother was not, he hadn't returned from the front lines, and he was, she didn't have to say anything more. He was killed in action, or maybe he died from starvation, or maybe he died from illness or something like that. Not necessarily bullets from the enemy, the bullets of the enemy. And we were just crushed. We were just crushed. But my life must go on. And my sister, two of them, there's two sisters, and they spoke English, and so went to the nearest city called Kokura, and the United States 24th Infantry Division was stationed there, They came up from the Philippines, They were stationed there. So my two sisters went there, and they found employment. So they supported my dad and me, and I was put into the school where I was there in 1940 and 41. And this time, my Japanese was no good. So I hadn't studied in Japanese for 5 years. So my Japanese was very poor. So again, I started 2 years behind my contemporaries. They were all in grade 7, but I started in grade 5. But that grade 5 was, that was a real challenge. And at that time, the class was studying Japanese classics. And they used very sophisticated, archaic language. And I didn't know what they were talking about. I was just, but one one element that saved me was that the teacher was an excellent storyteller, and he would tell us in an ordinary, everyday language about interesting. The hero of each section of the book was a real person who existed in history, and he would tell us about all kinds of story behind the, and most of them were samurai warriors, and I just loved listening to samurai. So he would tell us in very interesting way, and so so that saved the day. And so I went on from elementary to middle school, and I went on to high school, and I graduated from high school, grade 12 in 1954, spring. There was a U.S. Air Force base in the next township, about 3.5 miles away. And when the Korean War broke out, there was a Japanese Imperial Naval Air Station being built. When I left there in 1941, the base was being built, in the Naval Air Station. And when the war broke out, the U.S. Navy brought in these aircraft carriers, and they attacked Japan all over. And this Japanese Naval Air Station got attacked by the U.S. naval airplane, and it received heavy damage. But anyways, after the Korean War broke out, this air base, the former Japanese Naval Air Station, became a U.S. frontline air base, and they used to fly sorties directly from northern Kyushu to as far as the Manchurian border. Every day they would fly these F-51 in Mustang. They used to call them Mustang. They're very splendid aircraft, and they used to fly sorties directly from Japan to the Korean war front. And after the Korean War ended, this outfit from the Philippines called the 13th Air Force, they moved either back to the Philippines or they moved out, and other groups came in, and by the time I graduated high school, at that time the Japanese Air Force, well, officially you have to call them the Japan Air Defense, Defense Forces. So the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force has just started, and the air base squadron that employed me was charged with the training of non-pilot Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces personnel, whether it be aircraft mechanic, auto mechanic, or aircraft firefighters or supply men or whatever, anything that had to do with non-pilot. My squadron was charged with the training of these people. For the training of pilots, another outfit came, and they call it they call us Daisan Soju Gakko, the third pilot training school. And they started training Japanese Air Self-Defense Force jet pilots, and they brought in T-33 jet trainers, and they started training. So my squadron's mission was to train ground air self-defense force personnel, and I was put to monitor this base-wide OJT, on-the-job training program, and that lasted from 1954 to 1957, end of 1957. And the U.S. Air Force offered me another job at another air base, but by then my mind was made up to come back to Canada. So I thankfully and politely declined the offer. It's spelled in the alphabet, T-S-U-I-K-I, Tsuiki. And now it's a Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. And when I was there, it became a pilot training school. This is Daisan means the third Soju Gakko, pilot training school. They train jet pilots, and then later on, it became a fighter base. Now it's a fighter base. So if there's the radar catches some unidentified airplane coming into Japanese airspace, they would send a scramble, and some Japanese air self-defense pilots would go up and intercept whoever is coming through. Now it's a fighter base. Tsuiki Air Base, northern Kyushu. I was a civilian employee of the U.S. Air Force.
I see. Okay.
The squadron that employed me was in charge of the base, and they were put in charge of training non-pilot personnel. And the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force came in as a guest in the beginning, and it gradually took over the base from the U.S. Air Force, and they went on their own. So that after a while, while I was still there, the U.S. Air Force trained enough Japanese personnel, so they didn't need any more teachers. So the U.S. Air Force moved out. So they offered me another job at another air base. But while I was there, the Japanese, all the pilots who came to train there were all ex-Japanese Navy or Japanese Army Air Corps people. They're experienced. They didn't fly. They didn't know how to fly jet planes, but they're experienced pilot in propeller, so they catch on quickly. Yeah. So there's many experienced pilots who survived the war. Yeah. In fact, there was one particular pilot that stands out. He became a general after war, but he was a bosom friend of the commander of the Japanese Naval Air Arm that struck Pearl Harbor, the Captain Fujita. Well, at that time he was a lieutenant commander, but after the war, before the war ended, he was promoted to captain. It's the same as a colonel in the army. Captain Fujita, Mitsuo Fujita. He is the person who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, and his bosom friend was Minoru Genda. And Minoru Genda, he was one of the staff officers of Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the Pearl Harbor attack. He designed everything, and so this Minoru Genda was a staff officer of the strategic group that designed the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this Minoru Genda came to this base as a student of the jet pilot program. Yeah, and there were other officers who, some of them survived the Pearl Harbor and Midway and major battles in the Pacific. They're also all, the first batch of pilot trainees were all experienced pilots. They just got retrained to pilot jet planes in place of propeller aircraft. Yeah. My department was so involved in the training of non-pilot people. We always had lots of, we used to get the personal history. They used to send us personal history of all new incoming pilot trainees, and I got to meet quite a few of them, yeah. So I saw lots of history passing by, And one pilot who sticks in my mind most is he was from Kagoshima prefecture. He died. He participated in Pearl Harbor campaign and Midway and all the major battles fought in the Pacific. And he became a pilot, a fighter pilot. And when they were flying over, this was in the late 50s, early 60s, he was flying in formation with several other planes in a fighter jet. And his plane, his wings happened to touch another plane's wing, and so he was disabled. And he could have bailed out with these automatic, but the plane could crash into a populated area, and that would be disastrous. So he fought and took his plane out in the sea, and he died. So he's an experienced pilot, but his name was Colonel Ibusuki. Ibusuki. He from Kagoshima, and he died. The big loss. But when he first came to our base as a student jet pilot, he said that he survived the Pacific War was in itself a gift. So he said he's prepared to die for Japan this time in another bitter situation, not as a imperial, invasive kind of force. And the Japanese self-defense force exists as a democratic country's, representative. So he said he feels a real, what's that? Anyways, he feels a mission to do a good job, and he's prepared to die. And anytime he's asked to, he gave his life, not in the way that that he expected, but to avoid any great mishap happening. If he let his plane, if he bailed out and let his plane crash in a land area, they could crash in a populated area, and that would be a big. So he piloted his plane out to sea, and he lost his life. But yeah. And so I came back to Canada in May 1958. Although I was apprehensive of racial discrimination, I would call it roots or whatever. It's just like the salmon going upriver to where it was born, and my family was salmon fishing, so something like that. And so I decided to come back. And as Mitch was saying, this Hikawa Maru, that was about the only Japanese ship that survived the war because it was a hospital ship with a red cross insignia. So the U.S. Navy spared that boat. It didn't get all the boats that plied between Vancouver and Yokohama. They all got sunk. Every single one of them. the one that boat I went to Japan in 1939 was Heiamaru, that got sunk. And then the one boat I came back on called Hiemaru, that got sunk. And then many others got just sunk one after another. What they say 460,000 tons of Japanese freight, shipping was sunk. Oh, anyways, so came back to Canada on Hikamaru, and I came back after 12 years. And so once I landed here, I started looking for work. And I used to pound the streets, with necktie and all that. And after a while, I just, I couldn't give a damn what people thought. I just went there, go for broke kind of thing. I walk in, I'm looking for work. Have you got any job? And if they showed any signs of reluctance, I said, thanks, no thanks. And then I would walk, and I did that over and over, all over Richmond area and Vancouver. And one day, I came to Brookbond, Canada, and I thought, what the heck, no use, but I just said, I'm looking for work. Have you got any job? And the man said, yeah. So I said, could you repeat that again? He said, yeah, we got work. So I got a job. Brookband, Canada, they make red rose tea and all that kind of thing. So I got a job as a shipper, factory shipper. Any sales of coffee or tea, I'm in charge to get it loaded on the big trucks. And so I got that job in beginning of July 1958. But that job lasted only 4 months. And the fault is partially mine, because I didn't like the way the job, my immediate boss was conducting things. So I used to resist them subtly, not in a, not in a open way, but in end of October, I got laid off. But it's not. Well, literally, I'll face it, I got fired. And he said, we haven't got any work for you, so where you stay? He said, we're laying you off. Well, I got laid off at the end of October. So now I had situation being worse. I would have ended up in the Salvation Army's basement, homeless. But narrowly I missed that, because in those days there's quite a few Niseis like myself, most boys and girls both. They would, for room and board, they would find some families where they willing to take us in, and for little chores, we get room and board free. So I found that kind of place too, with a young lawyer family, and so I wasn't out on the streets, but I came close to it. Yeah, if I hadn't been there, I would have been out on the streets. And anyways, so somehow I got through the winter of 58, 59, but it was not a very cozy thing to a young, capable man not having work. And I was doing chores for the family, but that was how I got my meals, and so it's not a very it was never a very cozy, comfortable thing. But anyways, I survived that winter, and in spring of 1959, I was communicating with a nephew just 4 years younger than myself. He and I came back together, but he went straight to Montreal. My oldest and third brother were in Montreal from beginning of 1944. So my nephew went to stay with my third brother. we had 4 boys and 5 girls in there. Anyway, the oldest and the third brother were in Montreal. So my nephew went straight to Montreal, and he and I were communicating, and he was urging me to come to Montreal and don't bother staying in a place like Vancouver. There's so many discrimination and all that sort of. Why don't you, And so I finally made up my mind that Vancouver was not the place for me. So early 1959, I had earned enough. I saved up enough, more than I saved up enough money to buy the train ticket and eat my meals, and I had saved up enough to survive 3 months without working. So, and I had enough to maybe take in a movie or something like that. So I had 3 months preparation. So I went to Montreal, and I stayed with my oldest brother. And then I started looking for work. And in a couple of weeks' time, I had about three job outlets where I could pick the one that appealed to me most. And while in Vancouver, after I got laid off in October 1958, I somehow got hold of a IBM data processing center where the boss there allowed unpaid trainees to work on the IBM data processing machine, and I went there every day from November to about end of March, and I got quite a bit of knowledge in both data processing. So when I went to Montreal, I went looking for work as a data processor in the IBM system. And I had 3 job leads, and so I picked the one that appealed to me most, and I went to work for this company I worked there for about 17 months or 19 months. It was a company called L'Air Liquide. It's a company from France, Paris, France, and they had branches all over Canada. And the head office was in Montreal, so I worked at the head office. And after about 17, 19 months, I found work with Northern, they call it Northern Telecom. Later, the name changed to Northern Electric Company. It's just like Japan, Nippon Electric Company, NEC. That's the name of the company. So I went there and I worked there for about 17, 19 months. And after that, I found better job situation with Northern Telecom. So I switched over in late 1960. And I worked for this company just short of 16 years. And while I was working at Northern Telecom, I attended evening university. And I thought of going into teaching. And so I took a lot of art courses, and it was almost a double major. Geography, heavy, it's almost a double major in geography and history, but it mostly history. It was mostly geography that I majored in. Because it's a night course, I work during the daytime, and after coming home from work, I go to night school. So it's a very demanding thing. So I suffer a lot of sleeplessness and a lot of fatigue, and at first I took 2 heavy courses. And like they say, a man who chases after 2 hares get none. That's exactly what happened. And I was so discouraged. So that was in 1959 autumn. It took me about 3-4 years before I recovered, got back my both physical and mental energy. And in 1963, I went back with a renewed attitude, renewed vigor. And this time I changed to, I was first in commerce, but this time I changed to geography and history, hoping to teach history. But this time I took only one course at a time because, so it took me 9 years to graduate. And, in that time I failed few courses, and once you fail, you're still qualified to teach, write the supplementary test. But even the supplementary test, I failed, and so that's really set me back. And it took me 9 years to graduate, and that was a very tough trial that I went through. And by the time I graduated, this teaching situation was so bad. I had a couple of classmates in the evening university, and they had about 5 years teaching experience, but because they didn't have a university degree, they took evening courses to get the degree so that they could improve themselves. But after they tried to go back to school, even after 5 years of experience, they had nothing. And I had a couple of teacher friends who I had serious talk with them, and they advised that it was a very risky thing to quit work and not be qualified for unemployment insurance and no job promise. So I gave up my desire to go into teaching because I have to quit work for 1 year and go to teachers college for 1 year, and then I would get a license, but no promise of jobs. And so I quit work. I gave up my desire to go into teaching, and by that time, the political climate, the geographical climate in Montreal is very bad, especially in the wintertime. The temperatures really drop 20 below zero. That's nothing. One time it went down as 40 below, and 35 below. Many times I had. So then I have a couple of spinal cord injuries, and that cold winter was really hard on my back. So that for that reason, and the political climate, the separatist party won a landslide victory in the election in 1976, autumn of 76. The separatist party won a landslide victory, and the reality of Quebec going independent, separating from Canada, became a reality. A possibility. So I went through a lot of upheaval in BC as a child, mind you, in 1942, and a lot of unpleasant memories of 1950. So I didn't want to go through that again. So I thought about coming back to Vancouver, and many days I thought seriously about that. And so I decided to return to Vancouver, although still apprehensive of racial discrimination and joblessness. These two things were laid heavy on my mind. But the climate is nice here, so I thought I'll risk those two things. And I drove back to Vancouver with my wife in June 1977. And sure enough, the the joblessness was bad as ever, but the discrimination problem was vastly improved, vastly, very bad. But still, we used to hear of racial discrimination problem propping up here and there. And when I first got laid off in October 1958, the host family where I was working for, room and board, he was a lawyer, and I asked him if he had any connection, but he sadly told me that the banks, for instance, take bank, they had a very small what's that? Anyway, they had very few opportunities for Orientals. The Orientals were shut out, with a very small exception. So, there was no. And so, anyways, and when I came back here, I did some part-time job, and then that was 77. In 78, I was doing some volunteer work, and one was for the neighborhood house where I lived then, in near Victoria Drive and 49th Avenue. There's a South Vancouver neighborhood house. So I volunteered there. At the same time, I volunteered with Mosaic in interpreting or light translation. And while I was volunteering with Mosaic, one day I had an occasion to attend a conference of volunteers, and there I met Tatsuo Kage and Takeo Yamashiro and Yuko Shibata. They were in a conversation, and the Chinese guy named Rocky Yang, who was the coordinator of volunteers, he introduced me to these three people. That's how I got to know them. And that was in June. Yeah, June 1977. And the year after that, 1970, that was June 1978. And the same year, in September, Tonarigumi advertised for Japanese Canadians to help with the seniors from Tonarigumi. And in Montreal, I used to help my wife help seniors there who couldn't speak English. And so I had a little bit of experience in helping seniors, so I applied with Tonarigumi. And by then I had already met Takeo Yamashiro, so he hired me right away. And that's how I got started with Tonarigumi in September. Well, actually, my job started from October 1978, and I was there. Well, in between, I wasn't on the payroll because Tonarigumi was always on a shoestring budget, if no budget, So when there was no funds, we didn't get paid. So I was a volunteer. So that happened a few times. But I stayed with Tonarigumi till end of 1988. And by that time, the redress funds came, and Tonarigumi was, in a better shape. But my job ended there then, end of 1988. And from spring of 1989, I became a volunteer with Tonarigumi. At the same time, I became a freelance interpreter, translator. While working at Tonarigumi, I attended 7 months of court interpreting course, and received training in court interpreting. So I had a bit of connection with lawyer's office and this and that. And so I started freelancing as an interpreter, translator. And I continued volunteering at Tonagami till end of 2013. And I retired from translating, interpreting, translating work around 2009 or 8 or so, little before I quit Tonagami. And so then afterwards, I still volunteer, well, with the education department in this in the Nikkei Center, and whatever other volunteering that I'm asked, requested, and if I'm free and if it's something that I could handle, I could, but anyways, speaking, getting back, I'm getting back to what I experienced in the post-war years. The Japan that I went to in 1946, it was so changed from the one that I saw, even as a child. In the 40s, early 40s, it was the Japan military ruled the country actually. All the civilian politicians, they had very little power. So the Army and Navy, they went all over, did whatever they wanted to do. So I remember in Japan they have this morning assembly. I think every school has that. And one day the principal announced that from that day forth, all male students are the soldiers of the imperial nation of Japan. So every male student will stop bowing like a woman and behave more like a soldier. So every single male student must salute instead of bowing. So we, small kids, wherever we went, saluting. Instead of, Japan is a bowing nation, so we salute everywhere, and we were proud. We were bedraggled kids going saluting. I think if somebody had taken any newsreel or something, I think it would be quite comical, because we were instructed that, say we were walking along the street, and if in a group of 4 or 5 kids, and the first pupil that spotted an important person, say like mayor of the town or something, he must let out the commands, and everybody attention and salute, and if until the dignitary passes on, you must keep your salute, and that same student would say, all right, and then we would let her finish our salute. But that's how militarism really got hold of the whole country, and boys in grade 7 and up, there used to be a professional army officer assigned to our school, and there's a lot of old rifles from, I think, Russo-Japanese War. The corridors were just lined with rifles, the old rifles, heavy stuff, So all the grade 7 and 8 kids would be, they would obliged to go through military drill with a professional army officer, giving out the command and all that. So that's how militarism was really, it pervaded the whole country. But at least there was social order. Everybody behaved very correctly. Politeness was taken for granted. And when we got on the train or something, everybody's very polite and seated, and very polite. But once we went in 1946, it was the thing was just chaos. It was as if there was no government, and food scarcity, and we were eating food much worse than the chicken feed I used to give in the chicken in Bay Farm, Spokane. And that's how, even in the countryside, food was not plentiful. The the city dwellers would take clothes and things like that and barter with the farmers. Yeah, I give you this clothes to give me that much rice. And all that, and they used to call it. The bamboo shoots. When they start growing, they shed their skins. So this is. Our life is bamboo, like the bamboo. And somebody said, no, that's not it. It's like the onions. Every skin you peel, you shed tears because every time you barter, you lose something. So you said, this is onion's life. So that kind of life. And this kept on for the next 3-4 years. It was so bad. And when I left in 1958, rice was not allowed to be sold freely. It was strictly controlled by the government. So, anyways, when I went there in 1946, it was very hellish, and it was very. I couldn't believe my ears. I couldn't believe my eyes and ears when I saw all this disorder and this. And that hit me really hard because I knew the orderliness before the war, although it was, like I said, it was highly regimented because of the high militarism that pervaded the whole country. And I want to tell the Japanese people that the Japanese people don't know about Canada too much. Lots of time, and especially Canadian Japanese in Canada, they know a lot about. Nowadays, they know quite a bit about Japanese in the United States, but in Canada, the history is not too. They haven't studied history too much, so I want them to know that there are Japanese in Canada too who have gone through a lot of these hardships, and then that's for the Japanese student, but in Canadian students, the little kids who discriminated against me in school, that's because their parents or the adults at home are talking about, Japs did this and all this, Jap. So right away they're brainwashed from their boyhood days. They become racial bigots. So I want them to realize that the adults have a very heavy responsibility, that they should never talk bad or belittle other races, because that will automatically make their children, make their offspring become racial bigots, racially biased, right? So my hope is that they should not do that. So these kids who discriminated against me, they're too young to be discriminatory. They should be colorblind, but because the adults talk about us and anybody, they automatically inhale that and become racial bigots. That's I'm sure that's how it was when we were attending when I was attending grade school. And one very unpleasant experience I had at Kirshner Elementary School is that when the war broke out with Japan, the Red Cross started gathering material for the war effort to help the war. Any material, any metallic thing, or even rubber boots, rubber thing, everybody used to bring it to school, and because of my lack of English comprehension, I didn't realize these things that the kids brought to school was for the war effort. And there was one of these wagons, kids' wagons, the long handle, the metallic handle, and somebody donated that, and there's a big pile of all kinds of things, and all the kids took this wagon out into the playground, and we used to ride it down the hill and all, and after it got roughed up, the wagon fell apart, and the front part got severed from the last the other part, and it was just thrown, just left thrown, just it was just like junk in the field. So I have a salvation kind of mind that I like to gather things and reassemble it, and I have that kind of mentality or that kind of inclination. So I thought, oh, I'll take this home, and maybe I could, make a little, attach some box and make a little kind of wheel, some kind of wheel, and so I pulled it. It's two wheels and handles, so it's easy to take home. So I took it home, and that was a big crime, a criminal offense, not a treasonable offense. And one day I was in class, and then once the teacher in charge of, a male teacher in charge of this collection, he came and he spoke to my teacher and said, "The boy who wears this kind of, I couldn't hear, it was far away, so I couldn't hear, but the way he was, I was wearing a sweatshirt with airplane and all that, so I right away I sensed that he was looking for me, and the teacher said, my teacher said, she called me in, so I went with the teacher, and he took me to a small room, and he grilled me like a criminal, like a detective grilling a suspect, and somehow I was able to understand that he heard from somebody that I was the last one seen messing with us. So he wanted to know if I took it. And so I realized that I took it, so I said, I'll bring it back. But he grilled me like a criminal, and that was not very pleasant at all. But he was, he was quite disturbed. And imagine a Jap kid taking home something like that, more than a criminal offense, it's a treasonable offense. So I committed a treason. So I'm a Canadian, although I'm not treated like a Canadian. I'm a Canadian citizen, working against the efforts of the government, of the people of the government, the people of the country, nation of Canada. Oh yeah. Well, anyways, so my main aim, if I talk to English-speaking audience, is that adults should not talk negatively or critically about another race, because that would right away make the children become racial bigots. Mm-hmm. That's what I. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for listening to my sob story.